Welcome back to Thunga's Story Time, where history comes alive with the drama it truly deserves. Today, we're diving into the life of the woman who shattered every rule, outmaneuvered emperors, and built a dynasty with nothing but her wits and willpower. She started as a concubine, but rose to become China's one and only female emperor. That's right, Wu Zetian didn't just play the game of power, she rewrote the entire script. Schemes, betrayals, secret police, palace coups, it's like Game of Thrones, but real, and set in the heart of ancient China. So grab your tea, sit back, and prepare to meet the most dangerous and brilliant woman the Chinese Empire ever produced. Let's begin. Wu Zetian, origins of an unlikely empress. In the grand sweep of Chinese imperial history, few figures stand out as boldly, or as controversially, as Wu Zetian. She remains the only woman to ever rule China as emperor in her own name, breaking through barriers that had confined women to the shadows of power for millennia. But before she commanded an empire, Wu was a girl born into privilege, sharpened by ambition, and shaped by a vision of her own destiny. A birth beyond fortune. Wu Zetian was born in 624 CE during the early years of the Tang dynasty, a time of revival and prosperity for China. Her family, the Wu clan, was not of noble blood but had accumulated substantial wealth through commerce. Her father, Wu Shiwo, was a successful timber merchant who earned a modest government post, and her mother came from the influential Yang family. While not aristocrats, the Wu family enjoyed comfort, stability, and social standing, an important launchpad for a daughter who would one day dream of ruling a dynasty. In a society where most girls were destined for a life behind closed doors, confined to domestic roles or, at best, the wives and mothers of powerful men, Wu Zetian's path was already unusual. Her father, enlightened for his time, believed in the value of education and encouraged his daughter to study. Wu grew up reading classical texts, learning history, mastering calligraphy, and even discussing philosophy and politics, subjects largely reserved for boys. An education uncommon for her time. At a time when literacy was rare even among noble women, Wu Zetian's ability to read and write fluently made her exceptional. She was not just literate, she was articulate, persuasive, and insightful. While many girls were taught to be obedient and modest, Wu questioned, challenged, and argued. She studied the Confucian classics that emphasized female submission but clearly saw herself in a different light. The books gave her more than knowledge, they gave her vision. This early exposure to ideas and critical thought lit a fire in Wu. She developed a hunger not just to learn, but to lead. Her confidence, intelligence, and discipline set her apart, and even as a teenager, she was said to have a poise and presence that made others take notice. In the eyes of her family and neighbors, she was a precocious girl. In her own eyes, she was someone destined for more than the limitations placed on her gender. Shaped by the times, driven by ambition. China in the 7th century was a land of complexity, an empire teeming with contradictions. The Tang dynasty was open to new ideas, religions, and peoples. It embraced trade and culture. But it was still deeply patriarchal. Power belonged to men, and women were expected to support, not to lead. Wu Zetian saw these contradictions not as barriers but as opportunities. She recognized that the Tang court, though dominated by men, was also a place where intelligence and skill could sometimes outweigh birthright. She understood that to rise, she would need more than beauty, she would need to outthink, outmaneuver, and outlast her competitors. And so she began to imagine a path no woman had dared to walk, a path to political power. The court awaits. At the age of 14, Wu Zetian's life took a dramatic turn. She was selected to enter the court of Emperor Taizong, the reigning Tang emperor. There, she was given the title Karen, a 5th-rank concubine, not high enough to influence the emperor directly, but close enough to observe how power moved within the palace walls. To outsiders, this might have seemed like the end of her story, a bright girl absorbed into the imperial machine, destined to fade into obscurity. But for Wu, it was only the beginning. Her time in the court was not wasted, it was a masterclass in politics, human nature, and survival. She studied the people around her, the ministers, the eunuchs, the empresses, and learned the rules of the game they played. More importantly, she kept her ambitions intact. She knew she would not remain in the shadows forever. Legacy in motion. Looking back at Wu Zetian's early years, one cannot help but marvel at the clarity with which she understood her place in the world, and how she would reshape it. She was born into privilege, yes, but not into power. That she would one day seize the throne was inconceivable to her contemporaries. Yet every step of her early life, the education, the discipline, the sharpness of her mind, pointed towards something greater. Wu Zetian's story reminds us that greatness is not only born from opportunity but from audacity. She did not wait for the world to make space for her. She carved her own place into history, starting from the moment she picked up a book and refused to believe it was not meant for her. Wu Zetian, Into the Dragon's Court. At 14 years old, Wu Zetian left behind the relative freedoms of her childhood and entered the Forbidden City, one of the most secretive and powerful places in the world. She was chosen to become a concubine of Emperor Taizong, the formidable ruler of the Tang dynasty. Though she held only the low rank of Karen, a fifth-tier concubine in the vast imperial harem, this seemingly minor role would serve as the next step in her quiet but deliberate journey toward the throne. Life behind the curtain. The imperial court was a world apart from anything Wu had known. It was both dazzling and dangerous, filled with beauty, art, and splendor, but also teeming with political intrigue and ruthless ambition. Within the walls of the palace, hundreds of women competed for favor and status, their lives controlled by the ebb and flow of imperial whim. For most, this life was a gilded cage. But for Wu Zetian, it was a living laboratory. She was not a favored concubine. Emperor Taizong, already in his 40s, had his preferred women, and Wu, young, unconnected, and without noble backing, was unlikely to stand out. But she did not waste her time trying to compete through beauty or charm. Instead, she observed. She listened. She learned. She watched how ministers whispered to the emperor, how eunuchs carried messages, and how small gestures, an offering of tea, a well-timed compliment, a subtle glance, could shift the mood of the most powerful man in China. While other concubines sought comfort or status, Wu Zetian took mental notes. Every conversation, every decision, every punishment and reward became data in her growing understanding of how power operated. She was playing the long game. The emperor's library. One of Wu's few duties was to manage and catalog books in the emperor's private library, a position considered menial by most palace women. But for Wu Zetian, it was a dream assignment. Surrounded by scrolls of history, philosophy, politics, and military strategy, she deepened her knowledge of empire. She studied the lives of past rulers, learned the mistakes of failed dynasties, and absorbed the wisdom of great thinkers. And in these scrolls, Wu discovered something else, a confirmation that knowledge, more than bloodline or beauty, was the key to influence. She read the classics but questioned them. She studied Confucian doctrine, which said women should serve men, and yet found within those teachings loopholes, contradictions, and tensions that a clever woman could one day exploit. Though her days were filled with obedience, her mind remained independent, and dangerously ambitious. A fateful connection. During her time in the court, Wu Zetian caught the attention not just of Taizong, but of someone else, his son, Prince Liji. Unlike his father, Liji was younger, more sensitive, and more intellectually inclined. He and Wu shared conversations, subtle, cautious, but meaningful. Wu Zetian made a strong impression. She was intelligent, poised, and unafraid to speak with clarity and confidence. In a palace filled with competition and flattery, her authenticity stood out. Though no formal relationship existed between them at that time, a spark had been lit. One day, this bond would prove to be pivotal. Death and disappearance. In 649 CE, Emperor Taizong died after a long illness. By imperial tradition, any concubine who had not borne the emperor a child was to retire from court life and become a Buddhist nun. This was the empire's way of cleansing the former ruler's presence, both physically and politically. Wu Zetian, like many others, was sent to Ganye Temple, a Buddhist convent on the outskirts of the capital. To most, this seemed like the end of her story. She was 25 years old. She had no children. She had not risen to any significant rank. Now she would spend the rest of her life in religious seclusion, meditating and copying scriptures, forgotten by the world. But Wu Zetian was not most women. She endured the transition, observing the life of the convent as she had once studied the court. She participated in rituals, but never let go of her ambitions. And then, in a twist worthy of a legend, fate opened the door once again. Destiny's unexpected turn. A year after ascending the throne as Emperor Gaozong, Li Ji visited the convent and requested a ceremony at Ganye Temple. There, he saw Wu Zetian again. She was no longer a girl, but a woman, refined, self-possessed, and more compelling than ever. Moved by memory or desire, or perhaps by her formidable presence, he arranged for her return to the palace, this time as his own concubine. It was an extraordinary act, one that shocked the court and enraged his wife, Empress Wang. Bringing back a former concubine of his father was considered scandalous, even perverse. But Gaozong defied custom, and Wu Zetian, once again, entered the Forbidden City. This time, she was ready. She returned not as a servant of the emperor, but as a master of palace politics. She had seen how power worked, and she knew exactly what she wanted. And she would stop at nothing to get it. Wu Zetian, return to power, rise to empress. When Wu Zetian stepped once again through the gates of the Forbidden City, she was not the same girl who had entered it years before as a teenage concubine. Now in her late 20s, she returned at the personal request of Emperor Gaozong, formerly Prince Liji, who remembered her not only for her beauty and intellect, but for the impression she had left on his mind and heart. To the rest of the court, her return was scandalous. She had been the concubine of the late Emperor Taizong, and tradition dictated that she remain in religious seclusion for life. Her reappearance was more than socially unacceptable, it was politically dangerous. But Wu Zetian was not afraid of danger. In fact, She seemed to thrive in it. She had not come back simply to resume a romantic relationship. She had returned with purpose. She had studied the rules of court life, and now she was prepared to rewrite them. The palace's battlefield. Emperor Gaozong welcomed her back warmly, assigning her the title Thou Yi, one of the highest ranks among imperial concubines. But high status did not mean safety. Wu Zetian was entering a palace already filled with powerful women, most notably Empress Wang and consort Xiao, both of whom had their own factions, influence, and political ambitions. Wu quickly recognized that her path to true power would be blocked unless she removed her chief rivals. And so, she began the delicate and dangerous game of court strategy, a game she would eventually master like no woman before or after her. Where others used whispers and alliances, Wu Zetian used intellect, patience, and an almost surgical precision. She never confronted her enemies directly. Instead, she chipped away at their reputations, exposed their weaknesses, and turned their strengths against them, winning the emperor's favor. While the other women of the court competed through flattery, jewelry, and lavish entertainments, Wu Zetian approached the emperor with ideas. She discussed history and government. She offered counsel on domestic affairs. She positioned herself not just as a lover, but as a partner. Gaozong was frequently unwell and often uncertain in his decisions. In Wu Zetian, he found clarity, confidence, and quiet control. He began to depend on her, not just emotionally, but administratively. With each passing month, Wu grew in influence. Ministers began to realize that if they wanted their ideas heard, they needed her blessing. And her rivals noticed, too. The downfall of Empress Wang and consort Xiao. Wu Zetian understood that she couldn't simply challenge Empress Wang or consort Xiao head-on. Both had strong backers in court and long histories with the emperor. Instead, Wu began a whisper campaign, subtle, persistent, and devastating. She highlighted Empress Wang's lack of children, suggesting that the emperor needed a fertile consort to secure his lineage. She exposed consort Xiao's arrogance and manipulation, painting her as a threat to harmony within the palace. Then, fate, or perhaps strategy, delivered Wu Zetian the ultimate weapon. She gave birth to several children, including sons. In the royal court, producing heirs was more than a personal triumph, it was a political statement. Wu Zetian had not only won the emperor's heart, she had secured the future of the dynasty. But what happened next remains one of the most controversial episodes of her life. In 654, Wu Zetian's infant daughter died under mysterious circumstances. Wu accused Empress Wang of murder, a shocking claim, given the empress's high status and lack of motive. Some historians believe Wu herself may have killed the child, using the tragedy as a political trap. Others argue it was a natural death twisted into a weapon. Whatever the truth, the fallout was swift. Gaozong, already leaning toward Wu, now viewed Wang and Xiao with suspicion. Accusations of witchcraft, disloyalty, and conspiracy began to surface. In a dramatic and public fall from grace, both women were stripped of their titles, imprisoned, and eventually executed. With her rivals eliminated, Wu Zetian rose to the highest position a woman could hold, Empress consort of the Tang dynasty, an empress with a mind of her own. Unlike her predecessors, Wu Zetian did not see her new title as ceremonial. She was no figurehead, content to bear children and sponsor temples. She intended to rule. Once crowned, she began reshaping the court to suit her vision. She promoted officials based on merit rather than birth, brought scholars and reformers into her inner circle, and began exerting influence over court decisions, even those that traditionally belonged to the emperor. While Gaozong remained the official ruler, it was Wu Zetian who truly steered the empire. Ministers now whispered her name as often as his. She sat behind the curtain during meetings, guiding the emperor's thoughts, drafting decrees, and eliminating opponents who dared question her place in government. What had begun as an affair had become a regime, rewriting the order of things. Wu Zetian's rise to empress marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. She had fought, strategized, and outwitted her way into power, but she was far from done. Her reign would grow even more formidable, her control more absolute, and her legacy more controversial in the years to come. But in those early days as empress, one thing became undeniably clear. The woman once dismissed as a minor concubine had become the most powerful force in the Tang court, and China would never be the same again. Wu Zetian, the power behind the throne. As the years passed, Emperor Gaozong's health began to decline, casting a shadow over the Tang dynasty's grand court. What might have been a time of uncertainty for the empire instead became a defining moment for Wu Zetian, once a low-ranking concubine, now the de facto ruler of the most powerful empire in the world. Her ascent to actual power was neither sudden nor accidental. It was the result of years of patient strategy, political savvy, and unwavering determination. With Gaozong increasingly debilitated by chronic illness, Wu Zetian stepped forward to shoulder the heavy burdens of governance, demonstrating skills that few had expected from a woman in her position. A new role emerges. Though Gaozong remained the official emperor, the real command of the empire gradually shifted into Wu Zetian's hands. She was no longer confined to the inner chambers of the palace or the limited role of consort. Instead, she became a central figure in the administration, attending court meetings, making policy decisions, and directing the complex machinery of imperial governance. Her influence was not just symbolic, it was substantive and sweeping. Wu Zetian showed remarkable aptitude for leadership. She understood the delicate balance between tradition and reform, authority and flexibility. She worked closely with ministers and generals, often outmaneuvering established officials whose loyalty to the emperor did not always extend to her. Her decisions ranged from domestic reforms aimed at stabilizing the empire, to diplomatic efforts that preserved and expanded Tang influence across Asia. Mastering domestic policy. One of Wu Zetian's earliest achievements as a ruler-in-waiting was to overhaul the imperial bureaucracy. She was deeply aware that the Tang government's strength depended on its officials' competence and loyalty. To that end, she encouraged meritocracy, promoting talented but previously overlooked scholars and administrators from humble backgrounds. She reinstated the civil service examinations, a rigorous testing system designed to select officials based on intellectual ability rather than aristocratic birthright. This reform widened the pool of government talent, bringing fresh energy and innovation into the administration. It also helped weaken the entrenched aristocracy that often resisted change and clung to privileges. Wu Zetian's reforms went beyond staffing. She invested in agricultural development, recognizing that a strong food supply was the backbone of social stability and economic prosperity. She implemented policies that improved irrigation and land distribution, helping farmers increase production and, by extension, the state's revenue. Foreign affairs and military strategy. Wu Zetian's influence extended far beyond the palace walls. She was actively involved in managing the empire's foreign relations, especially in a period marked by shifting alliances and border conflicts. Under her guidance, the Tang military undertook successful campaigns that expanded Chinese influence into Central Asia and the Korean Peninsula. She skillfully balanced diplomacy with displays of military strength, securing trade routes and political alliances that benefited the empire. Her ability to coordinate these efforts demonstrated not just political savvy, but a strategic mind attuned to the complex realities of empire building. Challenges and opposition. Despite her growing power, Wu Zetian faced persistent opposition. Many courtiers and nobles refused to accept the authority of a woman, especially one who had once been a mere concubine. She was criticized for breaking with Confucian ideals that emphasized male leadership and female submission. Her enemies accused her of manipulating the emperor and undermining traditional values. But Wu Zetian was adept at navigating these challenges. She built a network of loyal supporters within the court and among the military. She employed intelligence networks to monitor dissent and quickly neutralize threats. Her rule was often described as ruthless, but it was also effective, pragmatic, and visionary. The emperor's shadow. Gaozong's health continued to deteriorate, and in many ways, Wu Zetian became the emperor in all but name. She presided over imperial audiences, issued edicts, and controlled appointments at the highest levels of government. The emperor himself seemed content to allow her this authority. Whether out of genuine trust, physical incapacity, or political calculation, Gaozong gradually ceded the reins of power. Wu Zetian's position was unprecedented. She was not yet officially the ruler, but her authority was absolute. Her name was whispered in the halls of power, her decisions shaped the destiny of millions, and the empire turned increasingly on her will. The quiet architect of an empire. This period of de facto rule set the stage for Wu Zetian's eventual unprecedented step, declaring herself emperor in her own right. But before that historic moment, she honed her skills in the shadows of the throne, learning how to balance power, perception, and policy. Her governance style combined strict discipline with innovative reforms. She embraced Buddhism as a source of political legitimacy, using religion to justify her authority and rally support. Her court became a center of culture and learning, encouraging poets, artists, and scholars. Under her guidance, the Tang dynasty experienced a remarkable flowering of civilization even amidst political upheaval. Legacy of the power behind the throne. Wu Zetian's tenure as the power behind Emperor Gaozong's throne marked a dramatic transformation in Chinese history. She shattered centuries-old norms about gender and governance, proving that a woman could not only participate in but dominate imperial politics. Her leadership brought stability to a vulnerable empire, revitalized government institutions, and expanded China's influence across Asia. Though controversial, her rule showcased a unique blend of intelligence, resilience, and strategic brilliance. Even centuries later, Wu Zetian remains one of history's most fascinating figures, a woman who rose from obscurity to command an empire, ruling from behind the throne with a hand both firm and visionary. Wu Zetian, Empress Dowager and Regent, the true power behind the throne. The death of Emperor Gaozong in 683 marked a critical turning point in the history of the Tang dynasty, and for Wu Zetian herself. Though her husband was gone, her grip on power tightened, and her influence reached heights no woman in Chinese history had ever seen. Traditionally, after an emperor's death, the throne would pass to his designated heir. In this case, Wu Zetian's son succeeded Gaozong in rapid succession. Yet, behind the facade of imperial authority, it was Wu Zetian who remained the true ruler of China. As Empress Dowager and Regent, she commanded the empire's political machinery with unparalleled mastery. The role of Empress Dowager in the hierarchical world of Imperial China, the title of Empress Dowager carried great prestige but did not automatically grant governing authority. Usually, an Empress Dowager acted as a respected matriarch and advisor, particularly when the new emperor was young or inexperienced. But Wu Zetian transformed this role into one of absolute control. Her sons, while officially emperors, were young and politically inexperienced. This provided her the opportunity, and the excuse, to govern as regent, claiming she acted in their best interests and in the empire's. Her authority was not challenged easily. She surrounded herself with loyal ministers and palace officials who ensured her edicts were carried out without question. She skillfully managed palace factions, sidelining rivals and consolidating power so that every decision passed through her. Palace politics and power play. Wu Zetian's time as Empress Dowager was marked by intense political maneuvering. The imperial court was rife with intrigue, as nobles, generals, and ministers vied for favor and influence. But Wu Zetian was a master strategist. She used intelligence networks and spies to keep close watch on her enemies. Those who dared oppose her often disappeared from the political scene, whether through exile, demotion, or more sinister means. Her approach to governance combined ruthless pragmatism with visionary reforms. She understood that to maintain power, she had to control not only the emperor but also the bureaucracy, the military, and the religious institutions. Ensuring the succession. One of Wu Zetian's most critical tasks was securing her family's hold on the throne. Her sons, although emperors by title, were largely figureheads under her direction. Wu Zetian orchestrated marriages, appointments, and alliances to strengthen her family's position. She kept potential rivals at bay, ensuring that no one threatened her line of succession. At the same time, she continued to strengthen her own personal authority, preparing the ground for an unprecedented move, her own ascension as emperor. Balancing tradition and innovation. While she wielded absolute power, Wu Zetian remained keenly aware of the delicate balance between tradition and change. She upheld many Confucian rituals and imperial customs, understanding their importance in legitimizing her rule. Yet, she also pushed boundaries. She promoted Buddhism as a political tool, using its moral authority to justify her unprecedented role as a female ruler. She commissioned grand temples and statues, linking her reign to divine favor. Her administration continued reforms begun during Gaozong's illness, improving the civil service, strengthening the economy, and expanding cultural patronage. A legacy of power and controversy. Wu Zetian's regency was a period of both consolidation and transformation. Her ability to control the empire's vast apparatus set the stage for her historic declaration as emperor in her own right, a bold move that would forever change the course of Chinese history. Yet, her reign was also marked by controversy. Traditional historians often painted her as a usurper, criticizing her ruthlessness and unorthodox methods. But modern scholarship recognizes her as a complex figure, a brilliant strategist, a reformer, and a woman who transcended the limits placed on her gender. As Empress Dowager and Regent, Wu Zetian was the ultimate embodiment of power, wielding it quietly but decisively, ensuring that the empire's fate was firmly in her hands. Wu Zetian, the founding of a new dynasty. By the late 7th century, Wu Zetian had already surpassed every woman in Chinese history in terms of political power. She had risen from a concubine to empress consort, from regent to the unchallenged authority behind the throne. But in the year 690 CE, Wu Zetian would go even further, breaking through every barrier of tradition, history, and patriarchy. That year, she officially declared the end of the Tang dynasty. In its place, she established a new imperial house, the Zhou dynasty, and declared herself the holy and divine emperor. It was a move that stunned the empire and rewrote the rules of Imperial China. For the first and only time in its thousands of years of history, a woman had claimed the dragon throne in her own name, not as the wife or mother of a ruler, but as emperor of China in her own right. A calculated revolution. Wu Zetian did not take this step lightly. It was the culmination of decades of political maneuvering, consolidation of power, and deep insight into the psychology of rule. By 690, she was already acting as the empire's true ruler. But to transform that unofficial authority into a formal title, she had to first build consensus, or at least remove opposition. She did this with careful planning. Using her vast network of spies and informants, she monitored court sentiment. She ensured her most loyal supporters were placed in strategic positions throughout the government and military. And she used religion, especially Buddhism, as a potent source of legitimacy. Buddhist scholars had begun promoting the idea of a female monarch based on spiritual texts and prophecy. One particularly useful prophecy spoke of a divine ruler, a woman who would bring peace and order to the world. Wu Zetian encouraged these interpretations, allowing her to frame her rise not as ambition, but as destiny. The fall of the Tang, the rise of Zhou. With her base of support secured, Wu Zetian moved quickly. She forced her son, then Emperor Thongzong, to abdicate. Rather than naming another male relative to take his place, she abolished the Tang altogether and announced the birth of a new dynasty, the Zhou dynasty, borrowing the name from one of China's ancient golden ages. She took on the title Shengshen Huangdi, Holy and Divine Emperor, elevating herself above even traditional male rulers. Her court ceremonials, robes, and decrees all reflected her unique status, not as a female ruler substituting for a man, but as an emperor in full command of heaven's mandate. The shock to the Confucian establishment was immense. Never before had a woman sat on the dragon throne. But resistance was quickly silenced. Those who opposed her found themselves demoted, exiled, or eliminated. To the people of the empire, Wu Zetian framed her new rule as a continuation of order and prosperity, not a break from it. She maintained many Tang institutions, but under the new Zhou name. It was both radical and cautious, a bold revolution hidden beneath a veneer of stability. Reforming the empire as emperor. Now ruling as emperor, Wu Zetian continued to build on her earlier reforms. She expanded the civil service examination system, further opening the government to talented individuals from non-aristocratic backgrounds. This move not only improved the quality of her bureaucracy but also helped diminish the power of entrenched noble families that might threaten her rule. She invested heavily in agriculture, infrastructure, and taxation reform. Her administration encouraged economic development, redistributed land to increase farming productivity, and oversaw the construction of granaries and irrigation systems. Wu Zetian also promoted education, scholarship, and the arts. She sponsored the writing of official histories and encouraged Buddhist texts to be translated and distributed. Her court became a center for culture and learning, rivaling any previous dynasty in sophistication and ambition. Image and legacy management. Wu Zetian was acutely aware of the importance of image. As a female emperor, she had to project not just strength, but legitimacy. She commissioned massive statues of the Buddha, one of which was said to be modeled on her own face. She ordered the construction of grand temples, used ritual to reinforce her divine mandate, and even altered official documents to emphasize her divine role as a ruler chosen by the heavens. At the same time, she implemented one of the earliest versions of a secret police, rooting out conspiracies and dissent. Her reign, though effective, was undeniably authoritarian. Loyalty was rewarded, but perceived disloyalty could be deadly. And yet, her policies kept the empire stable, prosperous, and secure. Trade flourished along the Silk Road. China's borders were defended. The peasantry was largely cared for, and the elite class, though under scrutiny, continued to benefit from the empire's wealth. Rewriting history. Wu Zetian's founding of the Zhou dynasty remains one of the most dramatic and unprecedented acts in world history. In a rigidly patriarchal society, she not only survived but dominated. Her reign questioned and redefined the very foundation of Chinese political and cultural norms. Historians in the centuries that followed would often judge her harshly, calling her power-hungry, ruthless, even immoral. Much of this was shaped by Confucian writers who saw her rise as a disruption to the natural order. But modern historians offer a different view. Wu Zetian was not an aberration, but a visionary. She ruled with intelligence, purpose, and results. Her achievements rivaled those of many male emperors, and her administrative reforms shaped Chinese governance for generations to come. Her declaration as emperor was not just a personal victory, it was a statement that power, vision, and leadership were not confined by gender. Wu Zetian, governance and control, the emperor's mastery of the empire. By the time Wu Zetian declared herself emperor of the newly founded Zhou dynasty in 690 CE, she had already shattered centuries of tradition. But claiming the throne was only the beginning. What followed was a rule marked by intense reform, centralized control, and a deep reimagining of governance. Wu Zetian wasn't just China's only female emperor, she was also one of its most effective rulers. Her reign brought political stability, economic growth, and a renewed sense of order to a nation often destabilized by aristocratic infighting and succession disputes. But she ruled with both vision and vigilance. Reform and repression went hand in hand. To build an empire that could withstand resistance to her gender and her audacity, she had to govern not just boldly, but absolutely. Meritocracy over aristocracy. One of Wu Zetian's most radical and lasting reforms was her challenge to the power of the aristocracy. For centuries, Imperial China had been dominated by noble families who treated high office as their birthright. Wu Zetian knew that if she wanted to maintain authority, she would need a new class of loyal, competent officials, people whose success depended on her favor, not their lineage. To achieve this, she expanded the imperial examination system, a civil service entrance exam originally designed to recruit talented men into government. Under her reign, the exams became more inclusive and rigorous, allowing men from lower social classes to rise through the ranks based on intellect and achievement rather than family connections. This strategy not only increased the quality of the imperial bureaucracy, but also helped her dismantle rival power bases. Many of her top administrators were men who owed everything to her, creating a loyal administrative elite with little interest in restoring the aristocratic order. Restructuring the bureaucracy. Wu Zetian didn't stop at recruitment. She reorganized the structure of the imperial court, streamlining government operations and increasing her oversight. She introduced new government departments, promoted transparency in accounting and logistics, and ensured that local officials were regularly reviewed. She was known to personally read reports from provinces and gave direct feedback, an almost unheard-of level of involvement for an emperor. This tight grip on bureaucracy allowed her to deliver on policy promises, such as equitable taxation and agricultural support. It also meant that she could reward loyalty and punish corruption swiftly, reinforcing a culture of competence and caution within the government. Agricultural prosperity and economic growth. Wu Zetian understood that the foundation of any empire was the peasantry. While emperors before her had often focused on grand military campaigns or court splendor, she directed resources toward agriculture and rural development. Her administration promoted land redistribution in favor of small farmers, repaired and expanded irrigation systems, and built granaries to prevent famine during poor harvests. These policies not only increased food security but also boosted morale and productivity among the empire's rural majority. By stabilizing the countryside and ensuring that peasants had access to land and food, Wu Zetian strengthened the empire's tax base and ensured long-term economic health, further legitimizing her rule in the eyes of common people. The machinery of surveillance and suppression. But prosperity came with a price. Wu Zetian knew that her position as a woman in power would always be fragile in the eyes of her enemies. To secure her reign, she built an extensive network of secret police and informants. This internal security system monitored not only provincial governors and court officials but even members of the royal family. Plots, both real and imagined, were exposed with chilling efficiency. Suspected traitors were quickly arrested, interrogated, and, in many cases, executed. The climate of fear kept open rebellion at bay. But it also fostered an atmosphere of paranoia. Friends betrayed friends, ministers watched one another, and whispers could become accusations. Historians debate the extent of her brutality. Some claim she relied heavily on torture and false accusations to remove rivals. Others argue that her tactics, while harsh, were not unusual for rulers of the time, male or female, and that they were necessary to hold together an empire in transition. What cannot be denied is that Wu Zetian's surveillance state worked. For over a decade, her rule remained unchallenged by large-scale rebellion or coup attempts, a rare achievement in any dynasty. Balancing reform and fear. Wu Zetian's reign was a careful dance between benevolence and force. She offered opportunity and prosperity with one hand and held firm control with the other. She patronized the arts and education. She protected the rights of commoners. She elevated Buddhism as the state's moral backbone. But behind the idealism was an iron will. Governance, in her eyes, was not about appeasement. It was about effectiveness. For her, the end, stability, prosperity, and the continuation of her dynasty justified the means. An empire transformed. Under Wu Zetian, China saw not only an expansion of opportunity but also a transformation in the very idea of power. She proved that effective governance could come from outside the male aristocracy. She showed that order and reform were not the birthright of noble families but the result of strategic planning, inclusive policies, and strong leadership. And while her critics would long accuse her of cruelty and ambition, they could not ignore the results. The roads were safe. The granaries were full. The empire was at peace. This was the China Wu Zetian ruled, a nation forged through merit, maintained through vigilance, and led by a woman who refused to be anything less than emperor. Wu Zetian, the sunset of an empire, final years and forced abdication. By the dawn of the 8th century, Wu Zetian's remarkable reign was nearing its end. She had accomplished what no woman in Chinese history had before or has since, ruled as emperor in her own right. Her power had been absolute, her reforms sweeping, and her authority unmatched for decades. But time, as ever, proved a formidable adversary. In her final years, Wu was no longer the iron-willed reformer who had dominated court politics with brilliance and precision. Now elderly and in declining health, she began to withdraw from the everyday rigors of governance. In her place rose two figures who would ultimately contribute to the unraveling of her hard-won legacy, Zhang Yizhi and Zhang Changsong, brothers whose charm and attentiveness won the empress's affection, but whose presence deeply disturbed the elite ruling class. The rise of the Zhang brothers. The Zhang brothers entered the court not through political acumen, but by capturing the personal interest of the aging empress. They were young, charismatic, and attentive, qualities Wu Zetian, increasingly isolated and frail, likely found both comforting and useful. At first, their roles seemed minor, confined to personal service and ceremonial duties, but gradually, they began to wield real influence. They acted as intermediaries, controlled access to the empress, and influenced appointments and decisions. Their proximity to power made them gatekeepers of the empire's inner circle. Many saw them as unqualified opportunists, parasites feeding off the twilight of an emperor's reign. To Wu, however, they were loyal and effective assistants. And perhaps more importantly, they filled an emotional void. With many of her earlier allies dead, exiled, or sidelined, the Zhang brothers were among the few who remained personally devoted to her. Court resentment and political tensions, but their ascent came at a cost. The traditional nobility, Confucian scholars, and military officials bristled at the brothers' influence. These powerful factions had long tolerated Wu Zetian's rule out of fear or grudging respect. Now, seeing her dependent on two seemingly frivolous courtiers, they sensed vulnerability. Their resentment simmered in silence at first, masked behind polite rituals and ceremonial obedience. But beneath the surface, plots were forming. The once stable court was now split, between those loyal to the empress, those resentful of her favorites, and those eager to restore the Tang dynasty by any means necessary. Even Wu Zetian's own family began to waver. Her sons, long relegated to the background, grew increasingly restless. Many among the nobility believed it was time to return to the Tang lineage and end the Zhou interregnum, especially now that the empress seemed no longer fit to govern. The coup of 705. The end came swiftly. In early 705 CE, a coalition of court officials and military officers, most notably Zhang Junzi, a senior minister loyal to the Tang cause, launched a palace coup. The conspirators stormed the imperial quarters in the pre-dawn hours, eliminating the Zhang brothers and surrounding the empress's private chambers. There was no great battle. No call to arms or dramatic defense. Wu Zetian, now around 80 years old, understood what was happening. The empire she had carved through strategy, boldness, and ruthless calculation was being pulled from her grasp, not by a rival state, but by the very institution she had once reshaped in her image. Faced with overwhelming force and betrayal from within, she abdicated peacefully, passing the throne to her son, Li Shen, who had once been removed from power during her earlier regency. He now reclaimed the imperial name as Emperor Dongsong of Tang, signaling the official end of the Zhou dynasty and the restoration of the Tang. Grace in exit, silence in legacy. In the months following her abdication, Wu Zetian lived in relative quiet in the Shanyang Palace, watched over but not imprisoned. While some of her supporters were purged from the court, she was treated with a degree of reverence, perhaps out of recognition for her years of rule, or simply because her removal had been achieved so cleanly. She died later that year, in December 705 CE. Her tombstone, notably, was left blank, a silence that spoke volumes. It reflected both the controversy of her reign and the uncertainty about how to summarize such a life. Her successors, particularly those loyal to the Tang restoration, attempted to erase her legacy, restoring the official history to emphasize the legitimacy of the Tang and marginalize her role. A woman who redefined power. But history proved difficult to silence. Despite the Tang court's efforts to minimize her legacy, Wu Zetian remained a subject of fascination and debate across generations. To her detractors, she was a tyrant, ambitious to a fault, ruthless, and immoral. They pointed to the executions, the secret police, and the Zhang brothers as evidence of a ruler who lost her way. To her defenders, she was a pioneer who broke the shackles of gender in a fiercely patriarchal society. She opened the civil service to men of lower status, championed competent governance, and presided over one of the most stable periods of the Tang era. In either reading, Wu Zetian was extraordinary. Her ability to not only survive, but thrive, in a political system stacked against her remains a testament to her intelligence, resilience, and vision. Her fall was not the result of failure, but of time, a transition that every ruler eventually faces. The final word. Wu Zetian's story is one of audacity and complexity. From her entry into the court as a teenage concubine to her reign as emperor, and finally, her quiet exit, she challenged everything about what leadership looked like in Imperial China. She rose in a world that told her she had no place in power, and built a dynasty of her own. She governed with wisdom and fear, lifted the humble, and punished the proud. And when her time ended, she left behind a country she had transformed. Centuries later, her tomb still stands at the Qianling Mausoleum, its blank stele whispering the truth that no words could contain her story. Wu Zetian, legacy of an empress. When Wu Zetian died in 705 CE, her long and revolutionary reign came to a quiet close. But her story was far from over. In the years that followed, imperial historians, most of them men loyal to the re-established Tang dynasty, began crafting a narrative meant to contain her legacy. They wrote of her ruthlessness, her use of spies, her manipulation of the imperial court. They fixated on her personal life, on the Zhang brothers, on her rivals who died under mysterious circumstances, on her breach of traditional gender roles. But history, as it turns out, is not so easily tamed. Centuries later, modern scholars and thinkers would revisit the life of Wu Zetian with new eyes, seeing not just a woman who ruled with power, but a woman who changed the very meaning of power in ancient China. Erasing a dynasty, preserving a legend. Immediately after her death, Tang loyalists acted quickly to restore continuity. Wu's brief Zhou dynasty was officially erased from dynastic records. Her name was often left out or replaced in temple titles, and later Confucian historians painted her as an unnatural ruler, a woman who dared to sit on a man's throne. Her innovations and reforms were quietly rebranded as the achievements of later Tang emperors. The civil service system she expanded, restored and credited to her sons. The Buddhist symbolism she wielded to claim legitimacy, dismissed as superstition or political theater. And her own tomb, marked by a blank stele, stood as a metaphor for the attempt to silence her voice. Yet despite all of this, Wu Zetian was never truly forgotten. Her name continued to provoke fascination. Secretly admired by some, feared by others, she lingered in folklore, operas, paintings, and unofficial chronicles. Her legacy, though distorted, remained undeniably powerful. A modern reassessment. In the 20th and 21st centuries, historians began re-evaluating Wu Zetian's reign through new lenses: feminist theory, political strategy, meritocratic reform, and statecraft. They found a leader who had reshaped China's imperial bureaucracy, replacing aristocratic privilege with examinations and promotions based on talent. She appointed competent officials regardless of their social background, an early step toward a more inclusive government system. Wu also strengthened the role of the state in agriculture and infrastructure, laying foundations for a more resilient economy. Rather than a mere tyrant, she emerged as a savvy and forward-thinking ruler, balancing reform with control, tradition with innovation. And perhaps most importantly, she governed successfully. Under her rule, the empire was stable, prosperous, and secure. She defended its borders, negotiated with foreign powers, and maintained the loyalty of her people, no small feat for any ruler, male or female. Gender, power, and perception. Much of the negative portrayal of Wu Zetian can be traced not just to her policies or methods, but to the fact that she was a woman in a role traditionally reserved for men. In Confucian China, female leadership was not merely rare, it was seen as an aberration. Wu knew this. She worked tirelessly to construct legitimacy, often through religious and symbolic means. She aligned herself with Buddhist prophecy, presenting herself as the reincarnation of Maitreya, the future Buddha. This spiritual narrative allowed her to justify her rule in terms the public could accept, even if the elite chafed under her authority. But modern scholars recognize that much of the critique directed at Wu was gendered. Many of the same actions, decisiveness, ambition, elimination of rivals, were praised in male rulers but condemned in her. The double standard was clear, and it colored the way she was remembered for over 1,000 years. Today, she is increasingly viewed as a case study in how societies treat powerful women, and how those women must often work twice as hard to be taken seriously, only to be remembered with suspicion or disdain. A symbol for the ages. Wu Zetian's legacy has undergone a remarkable evolution. In Chinese popular culture, she is now a fixture in historical dramas, novels, and films. Some portray her as a tragic heroine, others as a cunning villain, and still others as a proto-feminist icon. Each interpretation says as much about the society doing the remembering as it does about Wu herself. In academia, she is often cited in discussions of female leadership, authoritarian governance, and dynastic transition. Political scientists examine her consolidation of power, while gender studies scholars explore the unique pressures she faced as a woman in command. Even in the West, where her name was once obscure, Wu Zetian has begun to earn recognition as one of history's most formidable rulers. She is increasingly compared to figures like Cleopatra, Elizabeth I, or Catherine the Great, not just for her gender, but for her ability to wield power effectively in patriarchal systems. The blank stele speaks. Perhaps the greatest symbol of Wu Zetian's complex legacy is her tombstone, which bears no inscription. Some say she chose this herself, that no words could adequately capture her life, her ambitions, her triumphs and compromises. Others believe it was an act of erasure, a final insult by those who wanted to reduce her to silence. But today, that blank stele is read differently. It is no longer seen as empty. Instead, it has become a canvas, a space for ongoing debate, reinterpretation, and admiration. In a way, it is the most honest memorial a ruler like Wu Zetian could have. Not a fixed narrative, but an open question. Not a verdict, but an invitation to remember, and rethink. A final thought. Wu Zetian did not simply rule. She challenged every expectation of what a ruler could be. She rose from concubinage to command the largest empire on earth. She did it in a world built to exclude her. She did it with vision, intelligence, and a brutal sense of necessity. And though the men who followed her tried to bury her legacy, they could not. Her story survived, rising again, like the phoenix she once used as her imperial emblem. Wu Zetian remains a woman of contradiction, ruthless yet reforming, feared yet admired, forgotten yet unforgettable. And that, my friends, is the incredible, ruthless, and unforgettable journey of Wu Zetian, the concubine who became emperor, and the woman who changed Chinese history forever. Love her or fear her, one thing's for sure, you'll never forget her. If you enjoyed this wild ride through palace intrigue, political genius, and imperial ambition, Don't forget to hit that like button and smash subscribe so you never miss another deep dive into the most jaw-dropping stories from history. This is Thunga's Story Time, where the past is anything but boring. Drop a comment below. Who should we cover next? Another empress? A forgotten rebel? A genius lost to time? Until next time, stay curious, stay bold, and keep questioning the stories you thought you knew. See you in the next chapter.